Permission to greet you, Sergeant Henderson." The diner went silent. The young soldiers at the booth froze, their laughter still hanging in the air like smoke from a match just blown out. It was early morning in Albuquerque, New Mexico, the hour when the air still held the coolness of the desert night before the sun began its daily work of bleaching the colors from everything it touched. The roadside diner sat half awake, smelling of fresh coffee and fried bacon, its neon sign buzzing faintly above the cracked parking lot. Robert, or Bob Henderson, stepped inside, the door's bell giving a tired jingle. His jacket, once khaki, was now faded to the color of sun-baked stone. On the left sleeve, carefully sewn and kept spotless, was the patch of the 25th Infantry Division, a small square of color that carried decades of weight. His hands were steady, though lined with the mapwork of age. Bob didn't make a show of himself. He never had. He slid onto a counter stool, nodded to the waitress, and ordered a black coffee and a muffin. His voice was quiet, almost swallowed by the clatter of dishes behind the counter. At the next booth sat 4 young National Guard soldiers, still smelling faintly of the starch from their training uniforms. Their shoulders were loose, their laughter loud, each of them running on the high of a completed drill weekend and the sense that the world was just beginning to take them seriously. One of them, broad-shouldered, buzz-cut sharp, leaned back in his seat, glanced at Bob, and smirked. "Hey, look! The old guy's playing soldier!" The diner erupted in laughter, the kind that isn't truly cruel in its intention, but burns all the same because it's careless. One of them mimed a salute, another pretended to fumble with an imaginary rifle. Bob didn't respond. He took a sip of his coffee, eyes fixed on the slow swirl of steam. He'd learned long ago that some words aren't worth answering, and some lessons are better learned without your hand in them. But the air around him tightened. The waitress gave a sharp glance toward the booth, but the young man didn't notice or didn't care. A minute later, the diner door opened again. This time the bell rang with a sharper tone, as if it knew something the rest of the room didn't. In stepped a colonel in full dress uniform, the kind of presence that drew eyes the way a storm cloud draws attention on the horizon. His shoes gleamed like black mirrors. The ribbons on his chest caught the pale morning light. He scanned the room with the quick precision of someone used to locating exactly what he came for. His gaze landed on Bob. Without hesitation, he walked straight past the booths, the counter, and the curious eyes tracking him, and stopped directly in front of the older man. Then, in the middle of the quiet diner, he snapped to rigid attention. "Permission to greet you, Sergeant Henderson." The words landed like a dropped stone in still water. The young soldiers in the booth froze mid-laughter, their expressions shifting from confusion to dawning horror. Chairs scraped the floor as they stood, awkwardly at first, then quickly, almost tripping over each other to come to attention. The colonel's voice had carried, but it was the silence that followed that truly spoke. The colonel didn't relax his posture until Bob gave a small nod, barely more than the lowering of his chin. But it was enough. The man's heels clicked together and his salute dropped. He wasn't here for small talk. "Sergeant," the colonel said, his voice quieter now, but still carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm here because today is the funeral for General Matthew Carlisle. We need you there." The name struck something deep inside Bob, though his expression barely shifted. "Carlisle," he repeated, tasting the syllables like something pulled from a shelf in the back of his mind, something heavy, dust-covered, not touched in years. The colonel leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so that only Bob and perhaps the waitress refilling sugar packets nearby could hear. "The general's personal request, Sergeant. You saved his life. Cambodia, 1970. From the booth, the young guardsman's eyes went wide. Not a single one dared move or speak. Even the smirk from earlier was gone, erased as if it had never existed. Bob looked down at his coffee. The steam had thinned to almost nothing. "I'm not on any guest list, and this," he gestured at his weathered jacket, the scuffed boots, "isn't the right uniform." The colonel straightened, a note of quiet insistence entering his tone. "Sir, with respect, you're not going to miss this. We leave now." The diner's door shut behind them, muting the faint jingle of the bell. Out in the parking lot sat a dark government sedan, its paint reflecting the pale morning sky. The colonel opened the rear door for him without a word. As Albuquerque's low buildings gave way to the long, empty stretches of desert highway, the hum of the engine filled the silence between them. The colonel kept his eyes on the road. Bob kept his on the horizon. But after a while, his gaze drifted, not forward but back, 55 years, to a place that smelled of rain and smoke and fear. The jungle had been alive with sound that night, crickets and frogs thrumming like an endless drum roll beneath the steady hiss of rain on palm fronds. Henderson's unit was deep inside enemy territory, the kind of place that didn't appear on maps anyone outside the army would ever see. The op had been meant to be clean, recon, extraction, back to the border by first light. But clean and combat rarely shook hands for long. The first shots had come from the tree line, a sharp, cracking rhythm that tore through the rain's steady curtain. Bob remembered the moment he saw him, Second Lieutenant Matthew Carlyle, barely out of West Point, lying in the mud with blood seeping through his fatigues just above the waist. His face was pale, but his eyes were wide, locked on Henderson, as if trying to will him closer. There hadn't been time to think. Henderson had slammed a smoke grenade into the muck, yanked the pen, and let the thick white fog bloom around them. He'd hooked his arms under Carlyle's shoulders and dragged him backwards, boots slipping, knees sinking into the wet ground. Rounds cracked through the smoke, blind but far too close. The jungle felt like it was collapsing inward, every shadow holding a rifle. Henderson's breath had burned his lungs, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it was trying to punch its way out. But he didn't let go. He could still remember Carlyle's voice, hoarse and urgent, telling him to leave, telling him he was done for and to save himself. Bob had ignored it, every step heavier than the last, dragging a man whose weight doubled with each yard. Somehow they'd made it to the extraction zone, a clearing barely large enough for the Huey to set down. The bird had hovered, rotor wash tearing at the canopy. Henderson had shoved Carlyle inside, turned to cover their retreat with the last rounds in his rifle. By the time the door gunner pulled him in, his arms felt like they'd been filled with molten lead. But they'd made it, both of them. The hum of the sedan's tires pulled him back. The desert rolled by, outside, flat, endless, unchanging. "They offered you a medal," the colonel said suddenly, not looking away from the road. Bob gave a low grunt, didn't need one. Most men wouldn't have walked away from it. Most men didn't see what I saw that night. It was enough to get him out alive. The colonel didn't press. There was something in the older man's tone that didn't invite further questions. Fort Huachuca rose from the desert like an outpost from another era. Concrete, fences, guard posts against the mountains in the distance. As they neared the main gate, a pair of MPs stepped forward, rifle slung, hands raised in a motion to stop the car. "Identification and pass, sir," one said, peering in. The colonel presented his ID, but when the guard's eyes flicked to Bob in the back seat, his tone shifted. "Sir, I'm not seeing a clearance for your passenger. No pass, no entry." Before Bob could speak, the colonel stepped out, speaking into his radio in clipped bursts. The MPs glanced at each other, unsure. And then came the sound, engines, low and powerful, rolling closer. A convoy of military vehicles appeared from inside the base, dust trailing behind them. At their head, a jeep pulled forward and stopped right at the gate. From it stepped a man whose very walk carried command. His uniform bore 4 silver stars, his ribbon stretched wide across his chest. "General Lawson," the colonel said sharply, coming to attention. The general's gaze moved past him to Bob. He walked forward with deliberate steps, stopping directly in front of him. "Sergeant Henderson," Lawson said, his voice carrying the weight of a public announcement, though his eyes were fixed only on Bob. "General Carlyle requested that you be the one to carry him to his final rest." In his hands, Lawson held a simple wooden urn, polished but unadorned except for a small brass plate. Bob stood slowly. His hands, which had steadied rifles and wounded men in 100 chaotic moments, now trembled as they received the urn. It was lighter than he expected, but it felt heavy all the same.
The MPs at the gate had straightened unconsciously, their earlier skepticism gone, and from beyond the gate, the honor guard assembled for the memorial. Rows of soldiers in dress uniform turned in unison towards them, every man and woman snapping to attention. The silence was absolute. Bob stood just outside the gate, the Arizona sun already bright enough to sharpen every shadow. In his arms, the urn felt heavier than it should, its weight not in ounces, but in years.
The honor guard across the field held their salutes, motionless as if carved from stone. The stillness was uncanny. Even the desert wind seemed to have paused to watch. The colonel stepped aside, leaving Bob alone in the center of the moment. He didn't need to be told what came next. One slow step forward, then another. The gravel beneath his boots gave a steady crunch, the sound oddly loud in the hush. The MPs who had tried to block his entry stood rigid now, their eyes locked forward, their jaws set with something like shame. One of them, barely older than the guardsman from the diner, risked a glance at the urn and then at Bob's face. His Adam's apple bobbed once, hard, before he looked away. Near the entrance, standing in formation with another company, were the same 4 young guardsmen who had been laughing over their coffee not an hour ago. Their posture now was textbook perfect, but the stiffness in their shoulders gave them away. As Bob passed, they were the first to salute. No one had ordered them to. Their eyes didn't waver, though they held something more than military formality, an unspoken admission, a wordless apology. Bob didn't acknowledge it with words. A small nod was all he gave, but it was enough. They'd understand someday. The path from the gate to the memorial platform stretched longer than it looked, lined with service members in full dress, their gloves white against the dark wood of their rifles. Each stood at perfect attention, heads turning slightly to follow the urn's progress. Bob's mind flickered again to that night in Cambodia. The smoke, the rain, the slippery weight of a wounded man who refused to quit. The rotors above the clearing, and Carlyle's last look before the bird lifted away, half gratitude, half disbelief. He wondered if Carlyle had known in those years after that Henderson had followed his career from afar, not out of any need for recognition, but to be sure the young lieutenant he'd carried through hell had made good on his second chance. Carlyle had, and then some. The memorial platform stood beneath the shade of a white canvas canopy. Flags hung in neat rows, their edges barely moving in the still air. Rows of folding chairs were filled with brass, with veterans in civilian clothes wearing rows of ribbons pinned over their hearts, and with civilians, families, friends, strangers drawn to honor a man they'd never meet.
General Lawson stepped onto the platform and took the microphone. His voice carried effortlessly across the space, firm yet warm. Before you stands the man without whom General Matthew Carlyle and I would not have lived to see another day, Lawson said, his eyes sweeping the crowd. 55 years ago, in a place far from here, under fire that would have broken lesser men, Sergeant Henderson carried a wounded lieutenant through enemy fire and brought him home. Lawson paused, letting the words settle. Cameras from the press lowered, as if instinctively. This was not a moment to be recorded, it was one to be felt. Everything General Carlyle accomplished in the 5 decades since, every soldier he trained, every mission he led, every life touched by his service was possible because of one man's refusal to leave a brother behind. Lawson turned toward Bob. Sergeant Henderson, on behalf of the United States Army, I ask you to place the general in his place of honor. Bob stepped forward, knees stiff but steady. He lowered the urn onto the draped table at the center of the platform, the wood meeting the cloth with a soft, final sound. As he stepped back, the entire assembly, hundreds of soldiers and civilians alike, rose to their feet. In one synchronized motion, every soldier in uniform snapped a salute. The sound of so many hands striking brows in unison cracked like a rifle report in the stillness. For a long moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere in that sea of faces, Bob thought he caught sight of a woman in her 60s, her eyes red but proud. Carlyle's sister, perhaps. She didn't approach, didn't wave, but the look she gave him said enough. He gave a single nod in return, the same small gesture he'd given her brother in the mud and smoke of Cambodia. The bugler stepped forward, silver horn gleaming in the sun. The first notes of taps rose into the air, slow and solemn, winding out over the desert. Bob stood perfectly still, his hands at his sides, his face unreadable. When the last note faded, there was no applause, only silence. And in that silence, respect. The kind that can't be ordered or faked, the kind earned one act at a time, often far from any witness. The ceremony concluded, but the silence held for a beat longer, as if no one quite wanted to be the first to move. Bob turned from the urn and began the walk back down the center aisle. The first in his path were the 4 young guardsmen from the diner. They stood at attention as he approached, eyes locked forward, their earlier arrogance burned away and replaced with something quieter, respect born of knowing they'd been wrong. As he passed, each raised a hand in salute, not because an officer told them to, not because it was in the program, but because they couldn't not. Bob returned it with the smallest of nods. It was enough. Behind them, the formation of soldiers began to fall in step, the rhythmic click of polished heels on the asphalt echoing faintly in the open air. Bob kept his pace steady, his gaze forward, aware of the wake of every eye on him. From the edges of the crowd, civilians rose as well. Older men in caps embroidered with ship names or division insignias, women holding framed photographs, children who didn't fully understand but felt the gravity in the air. He didn't seek their eyes, but their silent acknowledgement reached him all the same. General Lawson caught up beside him before he reached the gate. "You never told anyone," he said quietly, almost to himself. Bob shrugged. Didn't need to. Carlyle knew. Lawson studied him for a moment, then gave a single slow nod, the kind of acknowledgement that required no further conversation. As Bob stepped through, the MPs who had stopped him earlier stood even straighter. One of them, young enough to still look raw in uniform, murmured a single word as Bob passed. "Sir." It wasn't protocol. It was gratitude. Beyond the date, the base fell away to open desert again. The colonel's sedan waited in the shade of a lone mesquite tree. But before climbing in, Bob turned once more toward the base. The honor guard was still at attention. The flag still stirred gently in the heat. And somewhere in that quiet, a promise had been kept. Not the kind written in orders, but the kind made between soldiers in the mud and smoke of a night long past. Bob took a breath, let it out, and opened the car door.
A year later. The desert sun was softer that morning, the air holding a hint of spring warmth. On the outskirts of Albuquerque, a newly painted sign swung gently in the breeze. The Henderson Center, a place for veterans to heal. The building itself wasn't grand, single-storied, adobe-colored walls with wide windows that opened onto a garden. But there was a steadiness to it, a sense of quiet purpose. Inside, the rooms had been arranged not like a clinic, but like a home. A library lined with worn leather chairs,
a kitchen that always smelled faintly of coffee and cinnamon, a wide porch where you could see the Sandia Mountains in the distance. The Henderson Center offered counseling for PTSD, physical therapy, and, just as importantly, space. A place where veterans could sit in the sun without feeling watched or walk through the garden without hearing questions they weren't ready to answer. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, the mayor spoke about service, the local VFW commander about sacrifice, the head of the VA about resources. Photographers snapped pictures of the crowd. Local news vans idled at the curb. Bob Henderson wasn't on the stage. Instead, he stood off to the side, just beyond the shade of the entryway awning. In his hand, a single white lily, simple, unassuming, like everything about him. He watched quietly as veterans and their families began drifting inside, some moving cautiously as if unsure they belonged, others stepping forward with the urgency of someone who had been waiting for a place like this for years. The colonel from the diner, still crisp in his uniform despite the heat, found him there. "People are already coming in," the colonel said. Bob nodded, eyes still on the doorway. Then it was worth it. There was no speech from him, no ceremonial cutting of the ribbon. The building wasn't about him. It was about the men and women who would walk through its doors in the months and years to come. He'd fought enough battles to know that the ones you win quietly often matter the most. A reporter spotted him and started to approach, camera in hand, but Bob was already turning away. He stepped off the curve and down the quiet street that led away from the crowd. His gait was slow but steady, the lily still held loosely at his side. The street was empty save for the distant sound of laughter from a playground a few blocks over. The sun caught the faded threads of the 25th Infantry patch on his jacket as he walked. He wasn't thinking about speeches or photographs or the fact that his name was on the building behind him. He was thinking about the garden in the back, how the chairs there would sit in the right kind of shade by mid-afternoon, how the smell of lilacs might drift through the open windows in spring. He imagined a veteran sitting there, coffee in hand, finally taking a breath without feeling the weight of the world on their shoulders. In his lifetime, Bob had walked away from more moments of recognition than most people ever received, not because he disliked gratitude, but because he didn't believe it was the point. In his mind, service didn't end when the uniform came off, and it didn't begin with applause.
The Henderson Center would stand as proof of that. Years from now, someone might see the name on the sign and wonder who Henderson was. Maybe they'd ask. Maybe someone would tell the story, or maybe they wouldn't. But a man or woman inside those walls would still be finding their footing again, and that, Bob would have said, was enough. By the time the speeches ended and the crowd inside thinned, Bob was already several blocks away, the lily now resting gently in the crook of his arm. He passed no one who recognized him, no one who saluted, and that suited him just fine. Some people need applause to know they've done right. Others just need to know that someone, somewhere, is breathing a little easier because of what they built. Bob Henderson belonged to the second kind.